we feared you had forgotten us. Now we live. We are no longer the castaways.
I am Sione Fatai. 5 classmates and myself from St Andrew's College in Tonga were shipwrecked on this island in June 1965. Ata Island has been taboo for a century, since the days when the slave traders took many people away. At first, Ata was not kind to us. Our small boat was broken on the rocks and we were cut and bruised when we came ashore. We lived, but our fights to stay alive was not yet over.
At home, but the seabirds that flew about the castaways contained moisture. They caught the birds in their cliff nests and drank their blood. Without the birds, the Tongans would have died on the rocks.
The Ata mountain is 1,000 feet high at its lowest point. For 3 months, we could find no way up. A ledge beneath the mountain became our home. We built stones around it to keep out the sea. We ate fish and birds. There was no fire to cook them. We were most unhappy here. We thought that soon a big sea would come and carry us away. We tried always to find a way up the mountain, but we could not.
But they never stopped trying to find a way. Time and again during the 3 months on the rocks, the castaways climbed part way up the inhospitable mountainside, only to be beaten back. Eventually, 100 days after landing on the rocks, they found what they believed could be a way up. The climb took 2 days. Several times they had to turn back and find another way. But eventually, they came to a coconut grove 800 feet above the rocks. Here they rested and regained the strength for the final effort to get to the top.
In a ledge at this halfway point up the mountain, we found old-fashioned knives. We cut the tops off young coconuts and drank the juice. We felt we had the spirit of the old people with us. For the first time since we landed here 3 months before, we were happy. We had the will and the strength to go on.
Before reaching the top, they had to call on all their reserves. But hand over hand, and at times inch by inch, they clawed their way up. Eventually, they did reach the top. This was almost another world. Gone was the savagery of nature below. Here they found a quiet, friendly place, almost a Shangri-La. Quiet breezes, birds, pineapples, pawpaw, bananas. Reaching the top had been well worthwhile. After the battle of 3 months below, they were happy to accept this quiet gift of nature.
First, a fire. We had no matches, but we hungered for warm food. Steveni remembered the old way of making a flame. It took many hours, but eventually we did have a fire. But from this day onward, it was never left unattended.
That first meal on the crest of the mountain was a banquet. They prepared green bananas, wild beans, fish. They had a tortoise from below and wild birds from the cliffs. Never was there such a meal. But at that time of physical conquest, they said to each other, "We are here through the grace of God." And before eating, they thanked him in prayer and song.
From my father's teaching, I remembered a way to obtain water. There are trees on the island that have water in their trunks. With wooden stakes and rough knives, it takes 4 days to dig deep. But then, drip by drip, we have water.
Next, they made a house, a folly of palms and bushes. Then they were able to move the precious fire inside. Each night as the flames died down, hordes of rats moved into the warmth. But beneath their crude blankets, the boys ignored them. After 6 months, it was beginning to seem like home. But the fickleness of the twins of nature and fate was never far away. One night, a 40-foot tree crashed inches from where they slept. But the nearest they came to tragedy on top of Ata was during a bird-catching expedition.
Mano and Sione had gone to the cliff top to search for seabirds and their eggs. They had 2 birds and were looking for more. Each day, we hoped to eat 2 birds each for our meal. Mano came back to the top with his catch, and Sione decided to go further down the cliff face where there were more nests. Then he slipped and fell. We found him on a narrow ledge 40 feet below. His leg was broken.
They treated the injury in Tongan fashion with hot coconut fronds. After 4 months, a scar remained, but he could walk. From a cliff-front lookout, they retained a constant vigil. They built a raft, but it was wrecked on the rocks within minutes of being launched. Then, they gave up hopes of escaping from Ata. They thought they may be marooned there forever. Tongatapu and their families might as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. Life on Ata settled down to be almost routine. At dawn and dusk, they heard roosters crowing. Somehow, almost miraculously, descendants of the fowls kept by the old people a century ago had survived. They found hen eggs which were good to eat, but the wily fowls at first were too elusive to be caught. After 6 months, it seemed they had been on Ata for an eternity. The routine of obtaining food, manufacture of bark ropes, and daily prayers continued. But the fear that they would never leave the island continued to gain strength. It seemed at times that they were destined to be on Ata forever.
We were often unhappy and at times we argued, but then we would walk away from our friends into the jungle. Sometimes we would cry a little.
The castaways used slates as a rough calendar, and to pass the time they composed songs and kept a record of them. About this time, back on the home islands, relatives were holding funeral services for them. But sad and unhappy as they were, the castaways were physically strong. They retained their inbred faith in the Almighty, and their will to live never flagged. A rough trap was used to catch the fowls, but the wild birds remained their staple diet. Running the fowls down by foot at night became a sport as well as a necessity for living. Eventually, 200 of the hardy game fowls were penned in hutches at the main camp. They were fed on coconut and other scraps. The fowls were eaten only when the storms were too severe for the castaways to obtain birds from the cliffside.
At times, it seemed we had been on Ata forever. We held tennis matches and boxing and trained with physical exercises every day to keep fit. We knew that if we became lazy, nature would beat us. One day in the jungle, we found the bones of an old man. He must have been one of the last of the old people to die on Ata. We buried his bones and said a prayer for him, and we hoped that he would never share his fate.
The 4 seasons had passed. A few semi-civilized changes embellished the daily routine, but in the main there was little change. Perhaps they decided it is true that we will be here forever. And so they set about to rehabilitate the island's fruit and vegetable crop. They replanted bean vines and made new banana plantations. They set a limit on the number of wild birds for eating and set about breeding up the poultry flocks. Then, one day, an event that they could scarcely believe. From the lookout, they heard the cry, "Boat coming! Boat coming!" The Australian trawler Just David was searching for new crayfish grounds. Had owner Peter Warner not decided to spend the night off Ata, the castaways almost certainly would still be there. But now, the Tongans were determined they would not be unnoticed. While one of them swung down the mountain track to the foreshore, the others bombarded the Just David with sound. On board, owner Peter Warner of Sydney and the trawler's crew were amazed to hear the sounds from the supposedly uninhabited island. And there they were, 6 young men, excited, waving, calling out as they swam, afraid that the trawler might leave before they could reach it. A few minutes more, and the Just David's crew was to learn the almost incredulous, fantastic story of the castaways of Ata. For the first time in 15 months, the Tongans were again in touch with the sight and sound of civilization. were given new clothes and a meal of beef and rice. And as the day ended, they remembered that their prayers had been answered, and they said, "Thank you, God."
These are our home islands, Tonga's Ha'apai group. Most of our families live here. They have received messages from Tonga Tapu that we are coming. We know these small boats. They're good to see. We hope our families don't think we have changed too much. A few of us had girlfriends too. Perhaps they won't remember.
Along the waterfront, the word was spreading, our boys have come back. Then it was time for laughter and for tears, for smiles and words of endearment as the long heartache eased. Never had there been such joy. For 3 days and nights of feasting, the island belonged to the castaways and their rescuers from the Just David. Among the small fry, the cult of hero worship was rampant, and the news of the lost 15 months. Queen Salotti was dead, there was a new baby brother, a sister married. But that was all in more than a year of yesterdays. Now was the time to celebrate the homecoming. The ovens must be made ready. All around the island, the fatted pigs were waiting. It was to be the biggest party in Ha'apai. As soon as one feast ended, preparations began for the next.
One day, perhaps we might return to Ata. Our population is rising and we need more land. If the king does release the ban, it could again be a good place to live. I think that if we had our families and friends with us, we would be happy. But we would never wish for anyone to go there like we did, as castaways.